All right, so welcome to another Deep Dive. And today we're going deep on something that I think is really important for, well, anybody who's involved with education at all.
Yeah.
Whether you're, a teacher or a parent, or even just interested in the learning process.
Right.
We're going to be talking about bias, specifically how hidden biases can actually kind of creep into the classroom.
Mm-hmm.
And we're basing this deep dive on an excerpt of some dissertation research that was done on implicit bias in education.
Interesting stuff.
Yeah, and I think the core concept here is that, like, look, we all have biases, right?
All right.
And we're not always aware of them. And these biases, whether we realize it or not, they can really affect how we teach, how we interact with students.
Absolutely.
So we're going to kind of unpack all that, and then talk about what we can do to create a fairer learning environment for every student, right?
Yeah, it's really important stuff, and it's something that I think we all need to be more aware of, especially if we're working with students. Just understanding how our own biases can play out in the classroom.
Right, exactly.
So, when we talk about implicit bias, we're talking about these attitudes or stereotypes that affect our understanding, our actions, and our decisions unconsciously, right? Like we don't even realize they're there a lot of the time, but
Right.
they're there, and they're influencing how we see the world.
Yeah, and it's not even like overt discrimination necessarily. I mean, sometimes it's just it's subtle things.
Subtle but impactful.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And for example, this research, one of the things that it showed is that teachers were more likely to interpret the same behavior as aggressive or disruptive
Wow.
if it came from a black student
Oh, wow.
than if it came from a white student.
Right, right.
So
It's just these unconscious, these implicit biases that are affecting how we're seeing the world.
exactly.
And that's why this is so important to talk about in the context of education,
Mhm.
because we're shaping young minds, we're creating these learning environments for kids, and we have to be aware of how our own biases are impacting that.
Right.
And it's not about blaming anybody or pointing fingers or making anyone feel guilty. It's just about recognizing that these biases exist
Right.
and understanding how they can lead to unequal treatment,
Mm-hmm.
and limited opportunities for students.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that's really the crux of it, I think.
Okay, so you mentioned different forms of bias, right?
Mhm.
Like racial bias, we just talked about that, but
Yeah.
are there others? I mean, like, what are some other
Oh yeah,
there.
absolutely. Yeah, I mean we see racial bias, obviously. That's a big one.
Yeah.
We also see gender bias. We see socioeconomic bias.
Oh, interesting.
There are many different types of bias.
Mhm.
For instance, a teacher might unconsciously call on boys more often in a math class.
Mhm.
Subtly reinforcing the stereotype that boys are better at math.
Right.
Or they might unintentionally give more positive feedback to students from higher income backgrounds,
Wow.
assuming that they have more support at home or whatever it is.
Wow, that's subtle, but
Subtle but powerful, yeah.
yeah, very powerful. Yeah, I mean, if you're a teacher who's listening to this right now and you're thinking like, "Oh my gosh, do I have these biases?"
Right.
The answer is probably yes.
Probably, yeah, to some degree. I mean, we all do.
To some degree, yeah, we all do, but it's not about like beating yourself up about it.
No, not at all.
It's about becoming aware so we could actually do something about it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So, okay, so what can we do? I mean, what
Yeah.
what are some practical steps
Yeah.
for a teacher, or even just anybody who's involved in education? Like, how can we kind of self-assess here?
Yeah. Well, one thing that I always recommend to people is taking an implicit bias test.
Hmm.
You can find those online pretty easily.
Okay.
And they can be really eye-opening.
Oh, really?
They can reveal those hidden biases that we might not even know we have.
Wow.
And honestly, I've known educators with very progressive views who were startled by their own test results.
Wow.
So it's a good reminder that these biases are ingrained in all of us.
Mm-hmm.
But beyond those tests, I think self-reflection is key.
Mm-hmm.
Just really taking the time to think about your interactions with students
Mm-hmm.
and ask yourself, why did I react that way to that student? What assumptions might be driving my responses? And seeking feedback from trusted colleagues can also be incredibly helpful.
Oh, interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, they might notice patterns in our behavior that we're blind to ourselves.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Because we don't.
Always see it.
Yeah.
So those are just a few things.
Okay, that's really helpful. Now, what about the actual materials that we use in the classroom?
Right.
Like, how can we make sure that, the materials themselves aren't perpetuating these biases?
Yeah, that's a crucial point, because the textbooks, the reading materials, even the examples that we use in our lessons can all carry subtle biases.
Wow.
For instance, if a history textbook primarily focuses on the achievements of white men, it might unintentionally reinforce the idea that other groups are less important or less influential.
So it's about making sure that the classroom reflects the diversity of the world around us.
Right.
Yeah. It's about representing different cultures, different perspectives, different experiences.
Yeah, absolutely.
So using diverse teaching materials is essential.
Okay.
But it also goes beyond that.
Okay.
We can encourage open dialogue about bias in our classrooms. Create a safe space for students and teachers to share their experiences and perspectives.
So what are some other strategies that teachers can use
Yeah.
to really address bias in their teaching?
Well, I think one of those powerful things we can do is just actively try to counter our own biased thinking patterns. If we notice ourselves reacting differently to students based on their race or their gender or their socioeconomic background,
Right.
we need to pause and examine why. Are we setting different expectations? Are we giving different kinds of feedback?
Right.
And it's an ongoing process, right?
Well,
It's not something that you just do once and then you're done.
Yeah.
Right? It's a continuous journey of self-awareness and adjustment.
Yeah. It's a process.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, this has been really insightful, I think.
It's important stuff.
Yeah, really important stuff. And, I think one of the big takeaways is that, this implicit bias can show up in so many ways in the classroom, and even the best intentioned educators can be influenced by it.
Right.
But the good news is that, by becoming aware of these biases
Exactly.
and taking steps to mitigate them, we can create a much better, a more equitable and inclusive learning environment for all students.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's the goal.
Yeah.
That's what we're striving for.
So for everyone who's listening out there, what are some steps that you can take? Whether you're a teacher or a parent or a student, to kind of identify and challenge these biases
Right.
in your own learning or teaching environment.
It's a journey, It's a journey, absolutely.
It's a continuous learning process.
It is. Yeah, it starts with awareness.
Absolutely.
And it's something that we all have to work on. So thank you for joining us for this deep dive, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks for having me. It was great to be here.
Yeah, absolutely.